Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. We have returning guest, I think 4-time returning guest now, Bill Smart. Welcome, Bill.
Cheers, James. It is good to be back.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on. It's always good to chat because we chat offline every so often on various different things, and then it's just like, hey, we should do a podcast on this. So that's exactly what we're doing. And before we get to some of the topics, Bill was on our first conditioning mentorship with Dr. Andrew Usher, and right now, cohort number 3 is open to start mid-September. So if you are wanting to learn more on conditioning and not just the, what would you call it? The typical way it's taught where it's like, you should do aerobic versus anaerobic conditioning. And then you should do lots of low intensity so you don't spike lactate, etc., etc. No, jump in this conditioning cohort, get a really good understanding of physiology and then how you can actually prescribe conditioning without worrying about things that usually don't really matter or are just wrong in terms of a physiological sense. So
yeah, I'd say it's like a good. I like that it's very like physiology first, and I think we talked about it a little bit in the past. You know, one of the biggest one of the biggest areas that we sort of have diverged a little bit from, I think, practical application of conditioning is, you know, we've taken energy systems, which is basically just like clumping a bunch of different physiological adaptations into these buckets and then run with them. When in reality, there's so many different, under that one umbrella, there's so many different physiological adaptations, mechanisms, and a lot of them have, varying different functions and can have opposing functions within under that umbrella. And yeah, if all you do is clump, you never have the ability to maximize. And the more you understand around those details under each, the more power you have to manipulate, which I think Andrew does an amazing job of, especially in that course. So I would recommend it.
I agree. So check out the link in the description for that. But we're going to jump to today's topics. We've got some really cool ones. And I think the first one we should cover is hopefully you're still there because it's a lot of lag.
Yep. Hopefully it's all good for everyone.
Yep, you're still there. Perfect. The first one we should cover is we're talking the other day about counter movement jumps, or we can call it just vertical jumps to make it really easy to understand. And I believe you're looking at the underpinning mechanisms within that, or at least let's just say the mechanical determinants within those jumps that separates top UFC fighters, I'm assuming, from the rest. So it'll be interesting to hear kind of your findings within that, like what you were trying to see, and then how, if that changes at all, I guess your approach to strength training for MMA.
Yeah, I think we can, like to give a bit of context. One of the biggest issues that you have when it comes to using performance testing information often is that we don't have great comparisons. So
move your mic closer too.
Oh yeah, is that better?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's good. That's nice.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll go right here. So what's really common is, especially in a lab-based setting, you go and send an athlete to a lab and they do a VO2 max or whatever it is. Maybe they do some power profiling. You almost always end up getting these results that are then contrasted to normative data of general athlete populations, and you really are comparing apples to oranges in that scenario, in which case it's hard to then say from that information, well, you could say as a blanket athlete term, this was good, but is it actually good for the application that you need to apply it? And that's more important, I think. So a big part of testing for me is, even this is a step further, is that, we have all this normative data, all this information from MMA specifically, but what we don't really have is, what actually separates high performers from non-high performers. And so it's always a question that I've had, and I think that there's a lot of powerful information in that. So basically we went into this, and it was off the back of talking to Gavin Pratt, actually, and he was discussing some of his observations in jump performance of athletes, which made me think a little bit more around. There were a couple of points that came up that sounded quite similar to some of the experiences I've had. So basically, I went through a lot of our jump data using jump as a reference point, and separated UFC athletes from like high level professionals. So not just talking like professionals who have had a couple of bouts. Like most of them, I either have been on or are going to be on like Contender Series, Road to UFC. A lot of them are like highly ranked in terms of regions. So it's definitely above what you would typically experience as like even like an elite group, I would say. So you're kind of looking at this sort of like, I guess, world class versus elite, and that's a space that is interesting. And for me, that holds a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that I want to look at. So when we ran through that was my biggest question was, what's different? Because when you look at normative data, if you were to compare UFC athletes to general sports, it's, for a counter movement jump, you're looking at jump height, it's quite bad. So, the average UFC fighter jumps, and this is across the UFC. This isn't my data, through like 35 centimeters. But we're talking on a force plate, impulse momentum. As context around that as well, when you report jump data, it's hugely important to know the metric that you're reporting, and the method. So, for instance, I had one athlete, he's a BMXer, jumped 95 centimeters on a vertic. I think he jumped 80 centimeters on a contact mat, and he jumped like 59 centimeters on a force plate impulse momentum. So that's really important. That's my context. Is there anything you want to clarify context-wise before we keep going?
Nope. Just for everyone to, like you mentioned there, when you hear that number, you're like, only 35 centimeters, and then people probably think like NFL Combine, where they have like their whole vertex set up.
Yeah, so I think to me, that already highlights, okay, like obviously MMA athletes more oxidative than we probably give credit to at some phases. But so what we did was went through, if we used a valid force plate, if you use valid, there's a lot of metrics, and a lot of them aren't the best metrics. So did some quality checks. Basically, what I wanted to look at was different phases of the jump, opposed to just typically what we would report is jump height, impulse momentum, power, watts per kg, and looking at maybe peak velocity, peak force. So we kind of broke that down a little bit more. Looked at the eccentric phase, so looked at the eccentric peak velocity, looked at the deacceleration point from eccentric peak velocity, which was eccentric deacceleration impulse. Looked at force at zero velocity, which is essentially the turnaround at the bottom of the jump. Looked at rate of power development, different rate of force development. It's a lot better from a reliability standpoint. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best in terms of something that's a bit more like force time related on the concentric element. And then looked at the normal stuff as well. And what was quite interesting was, in terms of effect size, the metrics that correlated the least. The metric that correlated the least was jump height to performance.
But by performance, you mean being world class,
competition level.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, we'll come back around to that, because that doesn't mean. I think what's really important is outlining that doesn't mean the jump height isn't important, which it can come across that way, as well as peak power. And basically what we found were the eccentric variables came out with the highest effect sizes. So eccentric peak velocity, eccentric deacceleration impulse, followed by forces and velocities. So really that ability to rapidly deaccelerate, rapidly put the brakes on, and turn around the contraction really became the primary differentiator between groups, which is I thought was very, very interesting. And also um, it's different to a lot of maybe what we think and what we know regarding physiology, but it's also not. Um, and when you start going through some of the research, there's bits and pieces of that. But yeah, it's interesting. So there's still a few things to unpack around some of that.
It's interesting. The first question that comes to my mind is because like at least MMA, I mean it's changing now, but MMA strength conditioning hasn't exactly been in the forefront in terms of strength conditioning for sport. So my question would be like, why do these world class athletes then possess this quality over the elite athletes? Because I'm assuming it's not down to their training leading up to that. I have a feeling that might be somewhat genetic, or is there something else going on? Do you think? If you're anything like me, you're short on time. Kids, family, work, training, and having to cook meals on top of that is just not going to happen. So I'm happy to announce Trifecta Nutrition are sponsoring the podcast. You get epic meals like these ones: turkey taco bowl, Texas barbecue protein plate. These are a couple of my favorites. But it means you don't have to prepare all your own meals, and it makes getting and good nutrition relatively easy. I've tried other meal delivery companies. Most of them are too high fat, not enough carbohydrates, or if you're getting kits where you have to cook it yourself, the portions for two is actually for one, especially if you are like me and you're training often. So if you want to take something off your plate and have meals like this delivered to your door, go down the description. There's a link there where you can order Trifecta meals. This is the performance line, which are higher protein and higher carbohydrate. And you can use code LIFTBIG40. You'll get 40% off your first order.
Yeah, that's the question. There's always going to be genetic elements to it, and you could bucket that in the sense of certain types of athletes may be more predisposed to being high-level fighters, and I would say that is probably the case. It's pretty much, it's not impossible to quantify. It's very hard to. Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like efficiency. Like you end up saying like what you're really looking at is jump efficiency is greater in terms of how you produce power, and then when you translate that to competition, like efficiency is everything when it comes to like producing power and technique and making it repeatable over a period of time. So I think we see a little bit of that. I do think like from a sport specific standpoint, there's I think higher level athletes often will have as a part of efficiency some of those like eccentric like qualities from a loading perspective. The ability to quickly like load go is something that's quite common as well. So whether or not there's a transfer from that. Interestingly, I was talking to Gus about this, and he, we talked around, you look at this and it's like, okay, cool. Concentric qualities didn't differentiate, but eccentric qualities did. And he was having a look through, and he's found there's a paper that looks at world-class sprinters versus like elite sprinters, and the differentiator for them, like concentric time was basically the same. Eccentric time was shorter, so they spent less time on the ground between groups. So there's something there in terms of qualities. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's definitely something I think that's of interest and valuable based on some of those findings.
Yeah, it's interesting. And if anyone's not familiar who Gus is, Angus Ross, he was on the podcast not too long ago. He actually talked a bit about that paper too, which is actually quite interesting. And with these eccentric qualities then, with these world-class guys possessing this, I'm assuming then that has influenced a lot of maybe how you've gone and I guess prescribed training for some of these MMA athletes. So I guess my first question there with this is, what are you doing then? Or at least what has become more prevalent in your training programs because of this information? Or is this stuff you've already been doing? Or I guess, yeah,
so
what's going on there?
Yeah, before we go to that, I think really, really important is like this is purely competition level based. I have looked at other I have run other metrics, other analyses around some of this as well. But like typically what you'd see with athletes as they move through training camp is you would see them move towards being more efficient with jumping. So generally jump height goes up over training camp and like modified RSI goes up as well. So essentially they load less and get more, which again comes back to efficiency, but is a little bit different to sort of what this highlights. And it also highlights that's quite important too. And as you start to look at athletes who have greater knockout rates and ability, you do start to see metrics like mod RSI, peak force, peak power start to go up as well. So it's really important to probably mention that those are still important and have their place, and that because jump height was a poor correlator in this scenario, it doesn't mean it's a metric that we're not interested in. It's just maybe the way that we view it is different. That makes sense. Maybe when we look at this becomes more of like a baseline or a screening tool, and from a monitoring perspective, or in terms of what we want to see from a ongoing training perspective, that's a little bit different.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you the how and why for the number that you're seeing of just jump height, because as you mentioned, like two guys can have similar jump heights but different strategies. And I think for anyone who wants to kind of see this in action is if you just watch like elite Olympic weightlifters jump, and you see like how deep they squat down and like almost slow with like little arm swing, because they just have so much strength in their legs. They just use all that time, and then they can just fucking like frog leap onto like plates over their head, versus you see those like skinny jumpers and you see how rapidly they descend and come up. And it's like two different jump strategies, could be similar jump heights,
100%. And that's exactly what, and that was probably something I missed when we were sort of prefacing it, was you see that when it comes to, if you don't standardize jump, if you don't standardize the jumping technique when you test, which is often hard because some athletes will just do as they do. You will see like some people, the method is generally like shorter dip, faster turnaround, big drive up, and then some athletes, they'll go all the way down real slow, and then they'll sort of jump up, and sometimes the height's similar, but the jump itself is completely different. So what you're using to jump, what you what you get from the jump is so different. So when you see those, it's kind of like, for me, it was pretty obvious that one of them was more likely to be someone who, deals damage, has greater knockout potential, and the other wasn't. But, you see similar jump heights, and then that to me highlights that, metric like height alone isn't enough, especially from a screening perspective. Like we really need to look a little bit deeper. So this essentially was my way of like looking as deep as possible and then sort of working back from it a little bit. But yeah, it's a really good point.
So has this changed any of your strength programming then for your, I guess, elite MMA guys?
Yeah, so I mean, what it highlights is like that the eccentric is very important, and like eccentric velocity is important, which is kind of interesting because we don't really do a lot of we don't really put a lot of emphasis on the eccentric velocity component a lot of the times in training. Like we do like we do a lot of like fast eccentric work through various methods such as flywheel training and such, but it's not necessarily something that has crossed over into different areas from like maybe even like a traditional lift perspective or plyometric perspective. In terms of cueing. So, and we talk a bit about some of the eccentric stuff a bit later, but I think that's probably one of the areas that I've started to put a bit more emphasis on is, the ability, like the actually cueing people to be fast on the way down, and to optimize that turnaround position. So for instance, if it's an athlete who is more likely to, be the athlete that sort of goes all the way down and slow down, drive up, now my priority in terms of changing that's quite high, because it tells me like there's some good qualities here. You're probably relying more on like connective tissue in terms of like that stretch drive and those deeper positions. Um, I want to have a bit more emphasis on shorter position, more, I guess, muscular based loading. Um, that's probably for the eccentric component in terms of velocity. Um, the time between contractions is something that we've probably known is quite important for a while in terms of being able to couple efficiently between contractions. That's another one that we do a lot of fast eccentric work around changing.
Are you
But that's
measuring that one
probably
too? Like eccentric, concentric, 200 milliseconds either side or something like that?
not really. It's just
Uh,
hard unless you're doing it on a force plate. You know what I mean? Oh, do you
yeah.
mean for contact time? Do you mean for plyometrics?
Yeah, like for the vertical jump. Like looking at like the last 200 milliseconds of eccentric to the first 200 milliseconds concentric. I think they've named that like an actual name now or something. But
For testing? I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
sure. No,
I think
not really. I haven't really
I
looked
think
at it, to be honest.
I
But
think it
maybe
might
that's
be.
something I should
I
look
think
into.
I think a company's actually coined it, like coined like
Really?
their name to it. I think so. But it'll be an interesting metric because it kind of gives you
Yeah.
that kind of turnaround time.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And that would feed directly into some of this because essentially, when you look at the eccentric deceleration impulse, you're kind of looking for like the time period is from peak eccentric velocity essentially to force at zero velocity. So the more you can condense that, highlights your eccentric braking abilities
Hmm.
basically. So which makes sense, and it's the same as from a technique like efficiency standpoint. Like the faster you turn around, the faster you can move from defense to offense. The faster you can move from offense to offense. So like and when you consider how many times you do that over and over and over again, like that's quite important. So we probably have always spent time on that, whether or not it's doing things like drop sticks, doing things like using the exafly. But yeah, that's sort of given me a little bit more push in terms of trying to make sure that we really cover those qualities. So it's
Hmm.
probably
Well,
influenced things more from like a screening perspective, and then using that information from the screening in terms of, I wouldn't say like bucketing athletes quite yet, but understanding how some of those phase qualities relate to a specific athlete, and then using the intervention to sort of course correct that a little bit. For athletes who already do that, it probably hasn't changed too much, to be honest.
interesting. I think shit, what was I going to say? I had literally had a question in my head that I was going to cover around the eccentric side of it. Ah, yes. In terms of like recovery, because I think a lot of the traditional thought is I can only do eccentrics for a few weeks because they're so intense, they're going to beat me up, etc., etc. Um, but obviously, it depends on the eccentric and what you're doing, but also obviously you have the repeated bout effect, so that soreness and kind of fatigue kind of dissipates as you get more used to the stimulus. I believe there was a paper. I just reviewed a paper last month on eccentric overload, and they were recovering within 48 hours in terms of their jump metrics and things like that from like heavy eccentric overload. And I believe there was
Did
another
you send
paper
that
before
one to
that.
me? Was it
No,
was it
this
different?
one was
Okay.
just last month. But did I send you
Okay.
another one? Because I'm trying to
I think
think.
you
I
did send me
remember
another
reading
one.
another paper.
I figured it was it the frequency of eccentric?
Yes, I did send you that one, but I reviewed
Yeah,
another one. I think that came out.
cool.
Oh no, that was the same one. That was the same one. I reviewed that one that I said I'm just checking now. So they looked
Oh.
at um, 3 times a week eccentrics on jump performance and the recovery between sessions in 48 hours based on the jump performance, and they found like full recovery within 48 hours, and they were doing 3 times a week eccentrics, which is interesting because you
What was
think
the
traditionally it's like one.
what was the overload on that one? In terms
Oh,
of,
I'd
did
have
they
to
say how
double check.
much?
Yeah, I'd have to double check. I read it a little bit ago. If I can even pull it up here. But what's interesting is then are you using eccentrics for like longer periods within training and kind of keeping them in most of the time?
Yeah, good question. Overload is a lot more sparing, honestly, and it's generally only in the off camp will we prioritize it. But even then, I think what's important is there's a lot of factors that will influence that. One of them is just the athlete, and especially the type of athlete they are. You probably find that athletes are a bit more, lower type 2 muscle would recover faster. Like some, if especially if you're quite a, especially if you're quite a fast twitch athlete, the recovery time definitely changes. But also, I think the biggest factor is the training load at the time as well. And I think it's probably where what you don't get to see with those types of studies. I'm not sure. Maybe they kept like, did they
They said they
mention
do. Eccentric
training?
overload increased progressively on a weekly basis by approximately 2.5% of their previous 1RM, basically. The pretest
Yeah,
1RM. Yeah.
yeah. I think when you factor in just the general stress of training in terms of training load, it's it definitely tells a different story from a
Mm-hmm.
recoverability standpoint. But yeah, but then there's also other factors too, and one of the big ones is just like how trained the athlete is. Of course, the
Yeah.
stronger the athlete and more developed physically, the more recovery time they're going to need. So yeah, I suppose there's different ways to approach it. I generally don't like to use them for more than like 2 to 3 weeks in a row.
Yeah.
But when I do it, I would like, you got to do it at least a couple times a week. Like 3 times is probably good. It's just important to note that training quality does get a little bit shit. So if you are doing it, for me, I have generally that's a conversation with the coach before it happens. So, the qualities that we're chasing from a gym perspective in terms of some of those strength and power qualities, they need to outweigh anything else that needs developing. So I think that's really important in terms of making sure the coach is aligned with
Mm.
that process.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the coach will,
Beast
start to
them.
wonder why the athletes, like performing like shit. Then they'll lose buy-in in terms of programming, and that's really bad. That's really bad. So that's probably just one thing that I would mention around that. And I think like
Yeah.
best practice, like you should do that anyways. But yeah, there's a difference in terms of what that will affect outside of.
Yeah. What's your experience then around like eccentric overload, say on a flywheel, like fast eccentric there, like drop catches, so your typical fast eccentric versus I guess you could call it quote unquote slow eccentric, where you're say doing 105, 110% 1RM squat or bench press as an example. Because at least in my short experience, like the faster flywheel stuff and the drop catches don't have the same, I'm going to say, negative effects as the
Definitely
heavier
correct.
loading. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely correct. I think it's definitely different in terms of like stimulus perspective. My assumption is you get a bit more from like a fascicle length perspective from some of the fast stuff as well. And if we were to translate it back to this, you're spending more time working on that force at zero velocity. So like that, peak braking sort of impulse. Those I do keep in like quite frequently. So I think like what's quite important to note is what you're chasing. For combat athletes, we often don't chase like fiber shifts from like an A to X, because that's it's often the opposite. But from a if you're trying to change fascicle length, it's adaptable reasonably quickly, but it's the same in reverse as well. So if you use it for 4 weeks and then you get rid of it for the last 4 weeks, then you basically will lose everything you gained for the first 4 weeks. So that's a bit different. And that's like from a dose perspective, that changes a little bit. Yeah, I would separate those two differently in terms of overloaded from more of a force perspective versus
Mm.
like a slow overloaded versus fast overloaded.
Yeah. 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 I tend to agree there. And then the last question on this topic I had is around, I know MMA is kind of like, you don't really have the style differences anymore, like pure grapplers, pure strikers, etc. But you kind of have like just a general MMA style now. But sometimes you have guys coming from different backgrounds. Have you found that's somewhat influenced some of that jump data too? Like maybe strikers being more of that eccentric or
Yeah,
better than that?
massively. Yeah, 100%. I think like it is often it is often grapplers that will, they just produce force over more time,
Mm.
which for them that's when you mention that that probably is generally that type of athletes that will have that slow load and go like to a point. Anyways, it's it's not always the case. But it is often the case, and yeah, so that's definitely from like a I guess a polarized training perspective. Um, that's something I want to course correct reasonably well. Just
Mm.
being aware as well around you still need people to perform in the areas they perform well in, so
Yeah.
there is a balance with that. But they're the ones who actually benefit a lot and a lot faster out of some of those coaching cues.
Interesting. And I wanted to also go into, I guess it's kind of a little follow on from this. I mean, you talked a lot about efficiency and how important, I guess, efficiency is in fighting. I think most people listening would agree and understand what you mentioned there. And when you sent me the cycling paper after our last podcast, the one with the cycling frequency and
Mm, yes.
the strength training, it's basically a replication study of the old, was it Hanneken paper from like the 80s, where they took the exact same protocol, but instead of comparing it to nothing, they actually made an explosive training group. And then it was, what was it, 20 something weeks of 3 times a week squatting versus 20 something weeks of like drop jumps and all that kind of shit. And then looked at 1, 2, and 3 hertz sprint cycling, and then looked at positive, negative work. Oh, wait, that was on, I think that was a reference paper in that paper you sent me. so that one,
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I get them mixed up all the time because they're on some of the ones. But regardless,
Yeah, no,
we
you
we
went.
get this idea of kind of efficiency, activation, relaxation with that. And you talked about how it's interesting with air bike. Now, when we had a chat around the air bike with, is there a potential limitation around these kind of higher frequencies and having power at these higher frequencies, because you're limited in terms of cadence on an air bike just because of the way it's set up versus, I mean, you've got fancy ass equipment, like flywheel bikes and shit like that, which lets you really nail that. So it'd be interesting just to, I don't know, just to chat and hear your thoughts on on potential air bike limitations in terms of maybe something to do with some of that like activation, relaxation, or efficiency, and if it's something to even worry about, and potentially what can be done, or if there's something needs to be done to maybe help improve that kind of higher frequency power, if that makes sense at all, because that was a long question.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's an interesting topic. And I mean, when you look at some of those jumping results, you could also attribute relaxation kinetics to some of those
Mm,
findings.
yeah.
Um, what what I and you go back a little bit. I know that there's a couple of papers that look at counter movement jump for MMA fighters. There's the one by there's two by Locke and James. I think they're both by him, which you may have read, but that looked at high level, lower level competitors, and they found that jump height was similar, and I think it was modified RSI was higher, so similar findings, which was quite cool in terms of the way that force was produced. Like force time was more important than um, purely output.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another paper. It's like they look. What was it? Stuart McGill with the double peak. Have you seen
Yeah.
that one?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was force plate, correct?
I cannot
In terms
remember.
of striking. So they found like the double peak in activation, separating higher and lower level athletes. So
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like there's a couple of interesting papers that sort of highlight the potential around the importance of that force time characteristic, and you can't really have that without relaxation and without rapid relaxation. I remember when I first started, I might have talked about it. I first started looking into, well, maybe not when I first started looking into it, but I remember hearing this quote from Conor McGregor ages ago. He was talking about like when he strikes, like he's trying to like disconnect the limb, like he's trying to fire and then disconnect the limb and then like reconnect it on impact. And I
Mm.
was like, that's awesome. And that kind of couples into it as well, because when you consider that, like, one, you are significantly more efficient from an energy standpoint, in terms of, you're not activating muscle that you don't need to. But then two, from a force transmission standpoint, there's an efficiency around being able to, use more elastic energy and contribute into that sort of end position. So that was, for me, like a starting point of like, this is pretty important. And then, you read that paper by like Jamie Douglas, which was fantastic, that sort of looked into more some of those like frequency kinetics. And to me, it probably highlights more around like physiological qualities versus like strictly like high frequency actions. Like, of course, especially if you're like you're in a lighter weight class, like being able to strike rapidly in succession is important. So there is a direct like contribution. But in terms of, how we train that from a, whether or not it's like a calcium utilization perspective, like I think there's a lot there that we probably don't understand a lot about. But one of the other things that we found, because we talked a bit about the power bike that we test athletes on, and this power bike gives us the ability to not just take peak power, but to take peak power over different cadences. So it basically goes up to whatever the athlete can reach, but maybe most athletes get up to 170, 180, depending on the weight class, how much power they produce.
170, 180 RPMs, you're saying? You're talking
RPM,
about, right?
correct.
Yeah.
So if you were to contrast an air bike, you're maybe getting 120, maybe.
If you're lucky, yeah, probably.
Maybe.
It's,
I don't even know if you're 120, might even be less. And this is,
I think it's like, I haven't looked at my cadences when I've been doing it. I've just been dying.
Yeah. Well, and we're talking absolute peak as well. So like the fastest you can get. So there's obviously quite a big difference. But what you find is, what we've found is a similar relationship in terms of the high level athletes producing more power. Like their power curve is significantly higher at the further end. So maybe from a peak power, generally athletes might produce peak power around 120 RPM, whatever it is. But athletes who are able to produce peak power at those higher cyclic rates have also separating competition levels, which is very interesting. Very, very interesting. So there's definitely something to it, and whether or not an assault bike has the ability to contribute to that, I don't know if it does, but it doesn't mean it isn't great in other areas, because but yeah, just there's a bit of food for thought there in terms of like use cases. In which case, like high cyclic rate, how important does that become, and how do we train it? I don't think an assault bike has the ability to do that.
Do you think that at least provides some of the physiological change that you may need initially? So like increased calcium sensitivity with that from the sprint intervals. Obviously you have the mitochondrial adaptations too, if you're doing sprints on it as well. Do you think that, I mean, it's not going to be the be all end all that you're doing, but do you think there is some carryover, or just at some point it's just diminishing returns, like you do it for a few
No,
weeks?
there's definitely going to be, yeah, no, you're right. There's definitely going to be carryover. It sort of becomes like, is this the way, is there a super maximal overload that's associated with some of that calcium handling? And I don't know, like it's probably not my area of expertise.
Yeah, we need Dr. John Babry to jump in now.
Yeah, seriously. we need Dr. John in here. But yeah, it is interesting. I think what I like about some of that as well is obviously when you look at high frequency, that transition between contraction types is, we're saying it's important here. Like we see it's important in competition. I think the ability to train it is quite valuable.
And we're not saying not to do air bike, and the air bike's not good. So for anyone listening,
the air bike is great. It's someone yeah,
exactly.
But I think you've also got to understand that, air bike it's essentially like a jack of all trades in some ways. You get a lot in different areas, but sometimes when it comes to dialing in different areas as well, there if you want to specialize, then using equipment that has carryover makes sense.
Yeah. And more on that frequency stuff, or let's just say the activation relaxation stuff. I mean, you've got traditional ways of that most people will know, at least from the research around there, like the sprint intervals we've talked about. I guess the general jump, like velocity, power based training kind of stuff, like your jumps and your throws, etc. You were doing something interesting with Kai Kara Franz for his last camp, as well with frequency. So what do you want to maybe just explain maybe what you were doing there and why, and maybe if there's other maybe unique ways that you're looking at training kind of this power frequency relationship and really trying to shift that curve?
Mm. So we do pretty consistently at least bouts of frequency based training throughout a competition period. Um, One way that we do it is I quite like doing it in ways that are reasonably sport specific, but I also like to do it generally as well. So we do things like rolling uppercuts, which you might have seen, and for me, you do have the ability to, if you want to look at it purely from like a task specific standpoint, you do have the ability to like rapidly overload um, successive strikes in within an exercise. Um, but what I really like about those is one, the frequency component to it that we get out of it. Two, it's highly complex from a neural perspective in terms of like intermuscular coordination. And I think that is something that what I've noticed with athletes, generally good athletes and good strikers will be able to coordinate that pattern quite well, and athletes that aren't won't. So I think there's a value point. I think we probably don't give enough credit to just trying to create change to some of those neuromuscular coordination adaptations, because it is pretty damn important. Whether or not it's from like an efficiency standpoint or from a performance standpoint. And if we go back to why potentially is, we talked to the frequency stuff. We talked to the Conor McGregor example of disconnecting and reconnecting a punch. I mean, when we consider conditioning, the more I can utilize muscles at the exact time that they're needed and for the exact duration they're needed, and then not use them, I mean, that is a huge benefit when it comes to conditioning. And I think that's where there are potential like limitations in conventional approaches. So this is, maybe there's a crossover from this perspective. A lot of that probably comes more from high quantity and high quality technical training. Um, but yeah, this is more about one, creating some benefit to that pattern. Two, overloading it from a like cyclic and frequency perspective.
What I really like about a lot of this and a lot of this chat is you always see over social media. There's a lot of talk about everything is GPP, right? Everything is GPP for everything outside the sport is GPP. And there's no such thing as specific training. Well, these are really good examples of what would be specific training. Even your like the eccentric stuff that you're doing, based on the data you have, would be specific to the sport of MMA. It's not general training. And yeah, you jump in.
I
You got something to say?
Yeah, I think like 90% of the time that's probably a good approach. When it comes to, you're trying to get the last 5%, it needs to be specific. And I mean, I think when we talk about efficiency, like the biggest aspect of efficiency is technical efficiency.
Mm.
And, the ability for the brain to activate like the right muscle at the right time is something that is like you can't put enough emphasis on how important that is. And it doesn't just happen. And it doesn't happen because, you spend time on an assault bike or you spend time running. Like it is a highly sport specific task. Um like from a conditioning perspective, some of the biggest gains in conditioning that you'll see that I've seen is just when you throw an athlete into like high volume technical training and you periodize it reasonably well. so they have the ability to be present and still have good cognitive function. Like during,
You know what's funny? You mentioned that when I was working in Tier 2 rugby, the World Rugby kind of shares a lot of the stuff that I guess other nations kind of do within the thing. And I think it was the build up to the World Cup. Which one was it? Last one or the one before? I think it was the one beforehand. And Georgia, I think it was Georgia, they were trying to rack up 50-kilometer weeks as part of their build up for building volume. Kind of like what you're saying, like just literally. I mean, I'm assuming that's probably not all technical training. It's probably a lot of actual running in that too. But spending a lot of time on the field doing the sport and building volume that way, like as you mentioned, perhaps that's kind of what they were getting at with technical efficiency within the sport, was just fucking hammering volume at that time. And then as you taper that off, you get rid of that fatigue, then you start to, I guess, flourish as you get more intense training in.
Yeah, 100%. I think, and a lot of the adaptations that we're trying to drive are very task specific as well from a conditioning standpoint. Whether or not it's mitochondrial, like whether or not it's some of those like vascular pathways. A lot of that is we talk about how we apply some of those different areas. When you consider the variability of MMA and all the different positions, you almost can't get that outside of doing it. And we often talk a lot about the sport specific training taking care of a lot of those maybe more like aerobic based adaptations. I would agree with that, but it also is not something that is always the case, and it often isn't the case. And I think that's something that's really important to be aware of as well, because you do run into a lot of issues when you don't have the ability to develop some of those adaptations in a sport specific state, because athletes don't do aren't doing what you think they're doing. And that's where that connection to the sport is so important. Because I don't think we should ever take any of that as a given. I think we always need to know, what are you doing from a technical perspective? What are the work to rest ratios? What are the intensities? What are the actions? And that gives us a lot more information around how we can best influence from that point onwards.
So what is it that you're typically not seeing in MMA technical training that you're trying to address outside that with conditioning?
Well, I think it depends. It depends on like a lot of the times, like the intensities. Like whether or not you're doing. I think there's we make assumptions that athletes get a lot of low intensity work, and often that is the case, but sometimes it isn't. I think sometimes we make assumptions around they get higher intensity, like more sustained work. So if we sort of think of that as your like longer intervals and things like that. Like sometimes those are more intermittent. Um, I think the biggest thing to be aware of is that different gyms have quite different systems, and depending on what they do, for instance, like some gyms, it's quite common you see people doing a lot of, whether it's like grind based circuit work or they do it in the skills work. And some gyms don't do any of it. In which case, you kind of have to consider like what are the adaptations that are being left on the table, and what is available, because those differences in system would completely change my approach in terms of what we do. And maybe an example is like sometimes athletes just don't get as much sports specific training, or maybe they just do a certain type. Maybe they end up just doing the lower intensity sessions, or maybe they just end up doing like rounds, in which case from an S&C standpoint, I know that strength and power, unless it's a massive target for the specific athlete, is probably not as important as some of those conditioning based adaptations. For me, that would influence then my distribution of training. And sometimes if the sport specific load is not as high or is less consistent than it could be, Like we might be doing more sports specific training in the sense that maybe their conditioning becomes more bag focused opposed to using something like an assault bike. But those things I'll fluctuate between a little bit.
Nice. So guys who are maybe getting more high intensity work on the mats, you're doing some kind of low intensity off the mats, and then vice versa. You're looking at more high intensities off the mats for the guys who are getting, I guess, enough low intensity work within their technical training would be like a little summary of that kind of framework.
Yeah, pretty much. I think, and of course, it comes down to the profiles of the athletes as well, from like a physiological standpoint. But yeah, there would always be little things. It would be like physiological profile. Like, what does the athlete need? Are they? What do we think that they're getting in terms of sports specific training? Are they getting it? If they're not getting it, do we need to fill the gap? And if so, how do we alter the training that we're doing to fill that gap?
Do you find that the maybe more skilled fighters are able to almost not coast through training, but I mean like they don't get as much of that high intensity work within their skills training?
Yes and no, depending on the sessions. Definitely
Yeah.
depending on the sessions. It definitely depends on training partners. So I think that's always going to be the case when you have better athletes who have less skilled training partners. If they're in an environment where they have skilled training partners, that's not necessarily the case. So it is still case by case, and I think that's I mean, it's one of the hardest things if you're in a performance role is knowing what that looks like in terms of what those you can have the exact same session and you can have two completely different outputs from it just based on something like training partners. So I think that is something that it's good to be aware of if you can, whether or not it's through heart rate monitoring, or if you have the ability to be in the sessions. But yeah, it's most gyms when it comes to anything that requires intent. Generally, you would expect better athletes to be with better athletes to mitigate that, but yeah, it's not always a given.
Yeah, fair enough. And I wanted to cover to round this podcast out, kind of actually blends well into what we've been talking about on efficiency and everything else. But I think one of the areas that you're quite interested in, I think most of us are, at least within MMA, is kind of the cost of going from grappling, whether it's on the ground or against the cage, into striking, and then obviously the back and forth within that and the toll that it can take. Any insights, new insights, or any kind of insights you have on that with maybe the cost of it and how fighters could better prepare for those situations?
Yeah, it's honestly the golden question, and I like to think we get a little bit closer, but it probably is.
Oh, I think it would be
require...
very applicable this weekend too with DDP Huns up.
Yes, I would completely agreed. Well, one, I think I think that if you were to look at how to maximize for that, it's a large approach. Like it requires a lot of time on task from a modality standpoint. When it comes to grappling and when it comes to striking, I think what you often see is striking based athletes engage in clinch, cage work, whatever it is, and then all of a sudden quality drops off and drops off more and drops off more. So how do we combat that? I think that's where, from like a starting perspective, you can't really get around spending a lot of time in those positions from a technical perspective. And we're talking like we can break that down to multiple components. You can look at technical from a skill perspective, and then link that into motor unit and specific muscular coordination into those groupings, and tie that back into efficiency. But then you also can look at that from a physical, like physiological, muscular perspective, where it comes to things like mitochondrial adaptation, when it comes to things like transport as well in terms of oxygen. I think that if you don't have the time on task to develop like mitochondria from a specific standpoint and those specific movements, you're going to find it very, very difficult later on to change that. So, when we talk about lower intensity training, if an athlete does, there's no way around it really. An athlete needs to do a reasonably high volume of grappling based training in those earlier time periods before they get into fight camp to create and maximize those like more local adaptations, as well as the um, technical and neuromuscular uh, points as well. Um, it's I don't think you can. It's very hard to make. It's very hard to make up for that if you don't have it. If that makes sense, and it comes back to trying to make sure that you come into fight camp in the right position, and then on top of that, obviously, like sprint training is important. But one of the bigger things we've focused on a little bit is when it comes to using sprint training and when it comes to creating these changes to mitochondria, well, we need to make changes to type 2 from a fiber standpoint. And we do need that to be reasonably specific as well. So modality wise, it's quite important to use things that, use the same muscles and reach those super maximal intensities. That's something that's quite apparent.
So what would be an example of that?
Well, it could be things like I think if you were to think about, say, a stationary bike, and then you would think about an assault bike, and maybe you would think about like a arm crank as those three examples, right? Even on a stationary bike, you're still going to be you're still using the arms. You know what I mean? Like you'd be surprised how much activation you still get even from a SMO2 perspective. Like you're still utilizing oxygen at those tissues. Assault bike is the same, but obviously much more local. And then you shift to an arm crank, which is, like extremely local. So I think that you probably need to spend some time in those types of modalities with high intensity work to have maximal transference. And when you look at MMA athletes and how they fatigue, it is, it's often the upper body, right? It's often the arms. And, probably one thing that we've noticed is, I need to chat to Andrew about this actually, is you have very different profiles from an oxygen kinetic standpoint, from the arms and from the legs. The arms always take a lot longer to recover. And you could probably attribute that back to the hardware is a little bit different. We walk around on our legs all the time. They're naturally built more oxidative. When it comes to the upper body, we just have a lot more like glycolytic fibers, which accumulate more lactate, and that's something that we probably need to account for as well. And that's where I think when you take that back to the high volume from a grappling perspective, I think that's where some of that starts to provide some really positive adaptations. And so essentially we're addressing the weak link from a grappling standpoint. And then you need to bring it together. So then it needs to become task specific. And that's when all of a sudden you're bringing your striking and your grappling together and playing around with those work to rest intervals in a way that's specific for the sport. That would probably be my consensus from a maximization at a higher level.
Yeah. So basically, quote unquote, non-specific sprint interval stuff, mitochondrial density, lots of grappling initially, and then to more quote unquote specific. I guess I kind of like it when you think about the transition. Like, I don't know if in PE in school, like we had to do like a duathlon in PE, like run, bike, run. And the hardest thing was the transition.
Yeah.
You spend all day, you could go for a run session, you could go for a bike session, whatever, but go from run to bike and then bike to run. Literally, I remember like everyone in the class was walking or running backwards that last run because they're all cramping. Because you're just not used to the transition. So I guess it's like how like our teams potentially like adding a lot of this transition style training? Is there even room for it to be done in the week with everything else going on? I mean, because it depends if it's a priority or not, right?
Yeah, I think what's really important is like that's a sport, like that is a sport specific component, and you will find that most, I would say most, if not all, high level teams are bringing those modalities together. Like it is quite common in different ways. Yeah, from an adaptation perspective, if you want to maximize it, it needs to be specific, but you need to have the hardware behind it to allow for those adaptations.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah.
yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that was
Yeah.
something. So that was something we used with Kai in the lead up to his last fight. And you're really just looking at those last 3 weeks, even when you're putting more emphasis on bringing those components together. So you develop all your pathways in terms of
Hmm.
energy, develop mitochondria, develop technical aspects, and then I mean it's it's not really different just to traditional periodization,
Yeah.
and then you bring it together. And I was quite impressed with the adaptability from that in terms of a NIRS standpoint, because we were able to run like monitoring on that for both sessions was actually quite impressive. So there's some it's something that I think is probably not applicable to most people in the settings that they're in, but it's something that's probably important to note. And also, you need to note the cost of those types of sessions and how that plays into the overall training as well. And
Hmm.
that does need to be accounted for. So maybe my message overall is like integration is key. Like you can't have things like this without having a proper integrated approach within the sport and the system. But when you do, the power that you have to like fine tune and be specific is high. And I think that you can't maximize performance without that.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to end this pod, Bill. It's always good to chat and get updates with what's going on and everything, and chat about it on the pod. Where can people keep up with what you're doing? You posting on Instagram yet?
Not really. I posted one the other like last week, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, you did too.
but I will. Yeah, at some stage I will post more. But Smarter Performance on Instagram, you can follow me, and um, yeah, it's probably the best contact point.
Sweet. I'll link that in the description too. I'll collab with you on some more stuff as well as I get more
No, I
content
appreciate
out. So
that.
that always helps. But yeah, we'll chat again soon, I'm sure, and we'll keep everyone updated.
Awesome. Cheers, James. I appreciate this.
No,
Cheers,
cheers for
everybody.
coming on. And we're